In a small, forgotten town nestled deep within a dense, dark forest, there was a library unlike any other. The townspeople called it the Whispering Archive. It was an ancient structure, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and windows perpetually fogged, as if the building itself breathed. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been the keeper of knowledge, a repository of all the world's stories. But there was one room that was always locked, one room that even the librarian dared not enter. The stories about this room were passed down through generations, whispered in hushed tones. They said the room contained books that no one had ever read, books that should never be read. These were the books that held the lost and forbidden tales, stories so terrible that they had been sealed away to protect the world from their malevolent influence. One autumn evening, as the leaves outside turned crimson and gold, a young woman named Elara arrived in the town. She was a scholar, drawn to the town by the legends of the Whispering Archive. Elara had heard the stories of the Forbidden Room, and her curiosity was insatiable. She sought knowledge above all else, even if it meant delving into the dark and unknown. Elara made her way to the library, her heart pounding with anticipation. The old librarian, a frail man with a bent back and trembling hands, met her at the door. "Are you here for the books?" he asked, his voice quivering. Elara nodded. "I want to see the Forbidden Room." The librarian's eyes widened with fear. "No one enters that room. The stories within are cursed. They speak of things that should never be known." But Elara was undeterred. She had studied the arcane, had faced dangers in pursuit of knowledge before. She was certain she could handle whatever she found in that room. Reluctantly, the librarian led her down a narrow, winding staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the walls damp and the light dim. They stopped in front of a massive iron door, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering torchlight. The librarian handed her a key. "I will wait here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you do not open the books." Elara took the key, her fingers trembling slightly as she inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the eerie silence. The room was vast, with towering shelves filled with ancient tomes. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a single candle flickering on a table in the center of the room. Elara approached the table, her eyes drawn to a book that lay open, its pages blank. She reached out to touch it, and as her fingers brushed the paper, words began to appear, as if written by an invisible hand. The letters twisted and turned, forming sentences that whispered to her in a language she did not recognize. But as she stared at the words, they began to make sense, seeping into her mind like poison. The story unfolded before her eyes, a tale of unspeakable horror. It spoke of ancient gods, forgotten by time, who hungered for the souls of the living. These gods were banished to the void, their names erased from history, but they had found a way to return, to whisper their dark desires into the minds of those who read their stories. Elara's breath quickened as she read on, unable to tear her eyes away from the page. The story told of a town, much like the one she now found herself in, where the gods had first appeared. They had whispered into the ears of the townspeople, driving them mad with visions of terror. The townspeople had turned on each other, their minds twisted by the gods' malevolence, until the town was nothing but a ruin of blood and despair. The final passage chilled Elara to the bone. It spoke of a scholar, drawn to the town by curiosity, who would unlock the door to the Forbidden Room and unleash the gods upon the world once more. Elara gasped, dropping the book as if it had burned her. The room began to tremble, the walls groaning as if in pain. The books on the shelves rustled, their pages turning on their own, filling the air with the sound of 1,000 whispers. She turned to flee, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. Panic surged through her as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The gods were calling to her, promising her knowledge, power, anything she desired if only she would surrender to them. But Elara knew what she had to do. She reached for the book again, her hands shaking, as she began to recite a passage from it in a language she did not know but somehow understood. The whispers grew frantic, the air around her thickening with a malevolent presence. She could feel the gods closing in, their eyes upon her, waiting for her to falter. But she did not. She spoke the words with conviction, her voice rising above the cacophony of whispers. The room shuddered violently, the shelves toppling over, the books spilling onto the floor in a chaotic heap. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The air grew still, the oppressive presence lifted. Alara was alone in the silence, the book now lying closed on the floor at her feet. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the cover. The title had changed. It now bore her name, and below it, a single word: Keeper. Alara knew what this meant. The curse had not been lifted, only transferred. She was now the guardian of the forbidden's knowledge, the keeper of the whispering archive. The weight of it settled on her shoulders as she walked back to the door, which had reappeared. The librarian was waiting for her, his face ashen. "It is done, then," he said, more a statement than a question. Alara nodded. The gods were sealed away once more. But the cost? The librarian shook his head. There is always a cost. Without another word, Alara handed him the book and turned to leave the library. As she stepped outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of voices that only she could hear. From that day on, Alara never spoke of what she had found in the whispering archive. But the townspeople noticed a change in her. She became reclusive, spending her days in the library, always in the company of books. And at night, the whispers would start again, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the silence with their insidious promises. But Alara never listened. She knew the danger of those whispers, knew that one day they might drive her mad. But until that day came, she would remain the keeper of the forbidden's knowledge, guarding it from the world, and the world from it. Yet deep in her heart, she knew that the whispers would never stop. They would always be there, waiting for the moment she would let her guard down, waiting to be set free once more. And in the darkest corners of the whispering archive, the books waited too, their pages filled with stories that no one should ever read, stories that could unravel the very fabric of reality. For in those pages, the gods slept, dreaming of the day they would awaken and reclaim the world as their own. Alara knew that she could never leave the town, could never abandon her post. For if she did, the world would fall to the horrors contained within the whispering archive. And so, she remained, alone with the whispers, a silent guardian of knowledge too terrible to be known. But as the years passed, the whispers grew stronger, more insistent, and Alara began to wonder how long she could resist them. How long before she too would succumb to the darkness that lurked within those ancient pages? And when that day came, who would be there to take her place? For the archive must always have a keeper.